Eleanor Graves wasn't born into wealth. She was born into hunger, not the kind that gnawed at the stomach, but the kind that burned in the soul, the kind that refused to accept small dreams. She grew up in a two-bedroom apartment that always smelled like burnt coffee and desperation. Her father, a failed businessman, spent his nights hunched over a ledger, cursing bad deals. Her mother worked double shift at a diner, her hands cracked from scrubbing plates. Eleanor watched. Eleanor learned. Money wasn't just power. It was freedom. It was the difference between being stepped on and stepping over. She started small. At 14, she bought bulk candy at a discount store and resold it at school for a 200% markup. By 16, she ran an entire underground business, homework services, essay writing, test answer trades. Teachers caught on. She got expelled. Her parents fought about it. Her father called her reckless. Her mother whispered, "She's just like you were." Eleanor didn't care. She didn't stop. She got her GED, enrolled in community college, took every finance course she could find, worked 3 jobs, bartender, receptionist, stockroom assistant, saving every dime. She had no trust fund, no safety net, just a brain built for numbers and risk. At 20, she landed an unpaid internship at Langley Financial Group, a name that controlled billions, a name that belonged to Victor Langley. Victor Langley was a legend, a self-made billionaire, ruthless in business, worshipped on Wall Street. He never lost. His deals were cutthroat, his instincts unmatched. Eleanor knew she had one shot. She worked longer than anyone, arrived first, left last. Read everything. Memorize market patterns, trade secrets, stock behaviors. When Victor spoke, she listened. When he tested her, she answered faster than his executives. One day, in the middle of a high-stakes meeting, a senior analyst froze, unable to calculate a portfolio risk on the spot. Eleanor, standing in the back, spoke up. 8.3% exposure, but a 14% growth potential if the market stabilizes. Silence. Victor looked at her. One long, slow glance. "You, in my office, now." She thought she was about to be fired. Instead, he poured himself a drink and said, "Tell me why I shouldn't ignore you." She did, in brutal, perfect numbers. He smirked. "Let's see what you're really made of." That day, Eleanor Graves stopped being an intern. Victor tested her. Every day, he threw her into deals designed to break her. She handled them. She outnegotiated veterans. She flipped a failing hedge fund into a top performer. She turned $2 million into $200 million in 6 months. People whispered about her. Some feared her. Others wanted her gone. Victor protected her, praised her, called her his protege. He taught her the rules of the game. The real rules. Loyalty doesn't exist. Power does. She should have listened harder. By 30, Eleanor had built an empire under Victor's shadow. She wasn't just a student anymore. She was a threat. She didn't see it. She still believed in honor among sharks. Victor acted like family. He toasted to her successes. He promised her control of Langley Financial one day. She trusted him. She was a fool, because in high finance, there's no such thing as mentorship, only predators and prey. And Eleanor Graves was about to learn what happens when a shark smells blood. Eleanor's first major deal was a hostile takeover. A struggling pharmaceutical company, drowning in lawsuits, was ripe for acquisition. Competitors circled, waiting for it to collapse. Victor watched, amused, as Eleanor stepped in first. She bought out their debts, squeezed their board, and forced them into a fire sale merger. Within weeks, she turned their sinking stock into a gold mine. Langley Financial made $500 million overnight. Victor's executives whispered, "Who the hell was this woman?" Victor didn't just smile. He raised her salary by 500%. You think like me. But he also started watching her more closely. Deals stacked up. Eleanor didn't just win. She crushed. She took corporate raiders and turned them into beggars. She outmaneuvered Silicon Valley VCs and left them bleeding billions. She rewrote the rules of finance. Langley Financial's profits skyrocketed. The media called her the Ice Queen of Wall Street. Ruthless, brilliant, unstoppable. Victor still called the shots, but Eleanor was the reason they won. And then she made a mistake. Eleanor pitched an idea, a vision bigger than Langley Financial. Not just hedge funds, not just acquisitions. A global financial network. Eleanor's name at the top. We go beyond banks. We create a system where the market works for us. Direct control of the flow of wealth. Victor nodded, listened, let her believe he was impressed. She didn't see it. The slight narrowing of his eyes. She had crossed a line. Eleanor wasn't just the golden student anymore. She was a threat, the warning signs. Subtle at first. Deals she was working on suddenly stalled. Clients she cultivated stopped taking her calls. Her access to company accounts was restructured. Victor remained warm, friendly. Trust me, I'm just making sure you're not stretched too thin. She believed him, because Victor had always been on her side. Hadn't he? The moment everything changed. A late-night email. A private board meeting. Eleanor was invited. She hacked into the video conference feed anyway. And there he was, Victor Langley, sitting at the head of the table, reviewing a contract with her name on it, her company shares, her assets, her empire, being transferred away. She stared at the screen, her heartbeat thundering. Then Victor spoke. Eleanor built something incredible, but she's young. She's reckless. We can't let her destroy everything we've worked for. The board members nodded, signed the papers. Victor looked straight into the camera, smirked. He knew she was watching. The illusion of loyalty shattered. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She sat in her penthouse, looking at the skyline. Everything she built was being taken. By the man who once said she was a future. By the man she trusted. She thought back to something he told her years ago. Loyalty doesn't exist. Power does. She should have listened. Because now, she wasn't just betrayed. She was at war. Eleanor Graves stood at the head of the conference table, her eyes scanning the room. The biggest deal of her career was about to close. The numbers were flawless. The acquisition would triple Langley Financial's global reach, securing their dominance for decades. Every calculation was airtight, every risk mitigated. Investors were on board. The contracts were drafted. The final step, Victor Langley's approval. She turned to him. He sat back in his chair, watching her, expression unreadable. She didn't know it yet, but this wasn't a deal. It was a trap. The shift had been slow, subtle. Victor had always been her mentor, her biggest supporter. But lately, there were cracks. Meetings without her. Conversations that stopped when she entered the room. She dismissed it. Paranoia, overwork, stress. But she should have seen the signs. Victor wasn't grooming her for success anymore. He was preparing to take her down. The email hit her inbox at midnight. Urgent. Internal audit findings. Possible financial misconduct. Her stomach dropped. She opened the report. False numbers. Missing funds. The entire acquisition deal, her deal, was flagged as a fraudulent scheme. Her name was all over it. A mistake? No. A setup. She grabbed her phone. Dialed Victor. Straight to voicemail. The board was meeting first thing in the morning. Without her. The next day, Eleanor walked into Langley Financial headquarters like a woman going to war. She had proof. The numbers weren't wrong. The missing funds weren't hers. But she never got the chance to speak. Victor was already there, standing before the board, his voice calm. I wish it wasn't true, he said, shaking his head. But Eleanor has been engaging in reckless behavior. Whispers, murmurs. Some members looked away. Others stared at her like she was a criminal. She stepped forward, hands clenched. This is a lie. Victor sighed. I try to protect you, but the SEC is already investigating. A beat of silence. Then the doors burst open. Federal agents stormed the room. Eleanor Graves, you're under arrest for financial fraud. Cameras, flashing lights, reporters already waiting outside. Her hands were wrenched behind her back. Metal cuffs snapped around her wrists. She looked up. Victor met her eyes and smirked. Hours later, she sat in a cold interrogation room. No phone, no lawyer. The door opened. Not an agent, not her attorney. Victor. He sat down across from her, calm, unbothered. "This isn't personal," he said. "It's business." She didn't speak, didn't flinch. "You were getting too ambitious, too unpredictable." He leaned back. "I built this empire. You thought you could take it from me?" She lunged forward. The cuffs held her back. He laughed. "You're done, Eleanor." Then he stood, walked to the door, paused. "Oh, and Langley Financial?" He glanced over his shoulder. "It's mine again." The door shut. Eleanor sat in silence. Her empire was gone. Her name was ruined. Her mentor, her enemy, had won. For now, Eleanor should have known. For weeks, the air around Langley Financial had changed. People whispered when she passed. Some of her closest allies suddenly became distant. The board meetings she used to lead were now rescheduled without her. Victor Langley, her mentor, her ally, had started treating her like an outsider. But Eleanor had been too focused on winning. The Merrick Holdings acquisition was the biggest deal of her career, a multi-billion-dollar merger that would make Langley Financial the undisputed leader in global finance. She had spent months structuring the deal. It was perfect, bulletproof, and that was the problem. Victor Langley didn't want perfect. He wanted control. Eleanor wasn't just his protege anymore. She was his competition. So he set the trap. Midnight, Eleanor's phone buzzed. Subject, urgent, internal audit results. She clicked the email. Spreadsheets, reports. The Merrick deal was flagged for fraudulent activities, missing funds, falsified numbers, and her name was on every document. Her chest tightened. This wasn't a mistake. This was a setup. She grabbed her phone, called her finance chief. No answer. Tried her lawyer. Straight to voicemail. Her executive team. Silent. She dialed Victor. This number is no longer in service. Her breath caught. No, this wasn't happening. The board meeting was in 6 hours. She had to fix this. The Langley Financial Tower loomed over the city, glowing against the early morning sky. Eleanor marched into boardroom. Every seat was filled. The entire board. Senior partners. Victor Langley at the head of the table. They were waiting for her. Victor stood, shaking his head. His voice was calm. Cold. "Eleanor, this is unfortunate." The screen behind him lit up. Financial records. Red flags. Warnings. The SEC was already investigating. Her stomach twisted. This isn't real. She stepped forward, slamming her hands on the table. "You know it's not real." Victor sighed. "I trusted you." He turned to the board. "I mentored her, gave her everything. And now—" He let the silence hang. Eleanor's pulse pounded. This wasn't a meeting. This was an execution. The doors burst open. Federal agents stormed in. "Eleanor Graves, you're under arrest for financial fraud." A flash of cold metal. Handcuffs clamped onto her wrists. Gasps. Murmurs. Reporters outside the glass walls. Cameras flashing. Eleanor looked up. Victor Langley was smiling. He planned this. Every second of it. She was done. The police station was cold. Sterile. The handcuffs left red marks on her wrists. Hours passed. No lawyer. No phone call. Then the door creaked open. Victor Langley walked in. Calm. Smug. He sat across from her. "I warned you." His voice was almost gentle. Eleanor didn't blink. Didn't breathe. "You got greedy," he said. "You started thinking you were bigger than me." He leaned back. "Now you're nothing." Her fingers curled into fists. Victor chuckled. "Don't look so angry, Eleanor. You should be thanking me. I'm letting you walk away." She froze. "What?" Victor slid a document across the table. A deal. If she signed, she'd avoid trial. She'd keep a fraction of her fortune. But she'd have to disappear. No company. No name. No future in finance. She stared at the paper. Victor tapped the pen against the table. Waiting. Sign it. Eleanor slowly looked up, met his eyes. Then she pushed the paper back. Victor frowned. Eleanor. She leaned forward. Go to hell. His smirk returned. Suit yourself. He stood, buttoned his suit, walked to the door, paused. Oh, and Langley Financial? He glanced over his shoulder. It's mine again. Then he left. The door shut. Eleanor sat in silence. Her empire was gone. Her name was ruined. Her mentor, her enemy, had won. For now. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Eleanor had built an empire. Langley Financial thrived under her leadership. Profits soared. Clients lined up. Her name carried weight in every major financial hub. And now, she was on the verge of her greatest victory, the Merrick Holdings acquisition. This was it, the move that would cement her legacy. She had fought for this deal, crushed competition, outmaneuvered regulators. Every number had been checked, every risk calculated. Now, all she needed was Victor Langley's final approval. She entered the boardroom, expecting a celebration. Instead, a room full of cold stares. Victor sat at the head of the table, fingers steepled, silent, watching. Something was wrong. But by the time she realized it, the walls had already closed in. Eleanor sat at her desk, scanning the email again and again. The numbers didn't make sense. Millions missing. Reports flagged for fraud. Transactions linked directly to her name. Her heart pounded. This was fabricated. She knew every dollar of the Merrick deal. There was no fraud. She picked up the phone, called her CFO. No answer. Her lawyer. Voicemail. Her executive team. Nothing. Then a second email. Urgent board meeting, 7 a.m. She didn't sleep that night because she knew she had been set up. 7 a.m. Eleanor stormed into Langley Financial Tower. The boardroom was full. Senior partners. Investors. Every seat taken. Victor sat at the head of the table. Calm. Unshaken. She opened her mouth to speak. Then the screens flickered to life. Her name. Her accounts. The missing money. Victor turned to the board, voice smooth, composed. I trusted her. We all did. A sigh. But the evidence speaks for itself. Murmurs. Shocked faces. Some avoided her gaze. Eleanor slammed her hands on the table. This is a lie. Victor folded his hands, then explained the numbers. She opened her mouth. The doors burst open. Federal agents flooded the room. Eleanor Graves, you're under arrest for financial fraud. A gasp. A flash of silver. Handcuffs locking around her wrists. Her breath caught. The cameras were already waiting outside. Victor leaned back in his chair, smiling. He had won. The fall, destroyed in an instant. They dragged her through the lobby. Photographers shoved cameras in her face. Reporters shouted her name. Eleanor, did you really steal millions? Is this the biggest financial scandal of the decade? How do you respond to Victor Langley's allegations? Allegations. That's all they were. But in finance, perception is reality. By the time she stepped into the police car, Eleanor Graves was already guilty in the eyes of the world. And Victor Langley? Untouched, unbothered, because he had orchestrated every second of it. The room was small, cold. She sat alone, wrists raw from the cuffs. No phone, no lawyer. Then, the door opened. Not the police. Victor. He stepped inside, adjusting his cufflinks. Sat across from her. His expression? Almost amused. Eleanor, he said, this didn't have to happen. She stared, silent. He slid a document across the table. A deal. Sign it, and she'd walk free. Keep a fraction of her wealth. No trial. No jail time. But she'd have to disappear. She would never work in finance again. Her company? His. Victor leaned forward. Be smart, Eleanor. Walk away. She looked down at the paper. Her empire. Her life. Gone. She picked up the pen. Victor smiled. Then she snapped it in half. tossed the broken pieces across the table. Victor's smile faltered. Eleanor leaned in. "Go to hell," he sighed, stood up, adjusted his tie. "Suit yourself." He walked to the door, paused, looked over his shoulder. "Oh, and Langley Financial?" His smirk returned. "It's mine again." Then he left. The door slammed shut. Eleanor sat there. Her empire was gone. Her name was ruined. Her mentor, her enemy, had won. For now, because this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Eleanor was released on bail the next morning. The damage was done. The headlines? Brutal. Eleanor Graves, from finance queen to white-collar criminal. Billionaire protege falls in spectacular fraud scandal. Victor Langley cleans house, saves investors from disaster. Langley Financial stock surge. Victor was hailed as a hero. Eleanor, wiped from history. Her accounts were frozen. Law firms refused to take her calls. Every ally, every friend in the industry, gone. She sat in her penthouse, lights off, staring at the skyline. This was what defeat looked like. She should have given up, should have taken the deal. But she wasn't built that way. Victor made a mistake. He didn't kill her. He left her alive. And that meant one thing. She could still fight. Eleanor sat in the dark. The city stretched beyond her penthouse windows, the skyline glowing with the power she once controlled. Her phone was silent. No calls. No messages. No allies. Victor had erased her, but he hadn't destroyed her. Not yet. The next morning, the reality hit hard. Her bank accounts? Frozen. Her legal team? Gone. Langley Financial? Completely locked down. She tried calling investors. No one picked up. She sent emails to former allies. No responses. Every door she had once walked through swung shut in her face. She was officially toxic. Then, the eviction notice. She stared at the paper in her hands. Her penthouse, the home she built from nothing, gone in 48 hours. Victor hadn't just taken her company. He had taken her entire life. She sat on the edge of her bed, gripping the sheets. No money, no job, no future. Victor thought this was the end for her, but he was wrong. This wasn't over. Eleanor's phone had been silent for 3 days. Then at 2:17 a.m., it buzzed. A message. Unknown number. They think it's over. Prove them wrong. She sat up, heart pounding. This wasn't a mistake. Someone was watching. Someone knew she wasn't done fighting. She typed a response. "Who is this?" 3 dots appeared. Typing. Then, unknown number. An old friend. A second message followed. Unknown number. Check the news. Now, she grabbed her tablet, fingers shaking, and opened a financial site. Then she saw it. Langley Financial stock was tanking. Not drastically. Not enough to cause panic. But just enough to make Victor nervous. Eleanor's lips curled into a smile. Someone was already making the first move. She wasn't alone. And that meant she had a chance. Eleanor didn't have money, didn't have power, but she had something more dangerous. Knowledge. She knew every secret Langley Financial buried. She knew where Victor hid his skeletons. She knew how to bleed him out slowly, painfully, but she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies, and she knew exactly where to find them. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and desperation. Eleanor slid into a booth. Across from her sat Michael Crane. Once, he had been Langley Financial's top attorney. Now, disbarred, bankrupt, living off stale toast and bad whiskey. Because of Victor. Eleanor placed a folder on the table. Crane raised an eyebrow. "If this is a job offer, I don't do corporate law anymore." Eleanor smirked. "It's not a job. It's revenge." She flipped the folder open. Inside, a list of hidden offshore accounts Victor never disclosed. Crane's eyes widened. Eleanor leaned in. "I don't need a lawyer. I need someone who knows how to burn a billionaire to the ground." Silence. Then, Crane grinned. "I hope you have a plan, Graves." She did. And this was just the beginning. By sunrise, Eleanor had a team. Not a corporate boardroom. Not an army of investors. but exiles, underdogs, people Victor had ruined. Michael Crane, the disbarred lawyer. Lena Cho, the hacker Victor thought he buried. Daniel Ross, the journalist who lost his career exposing Langley Financial. They had nothing left to lose, and that made them dangerous. That night, the first hit landed. A leaked document. A single thread pulled. Langley Financial's offshore accounts exposed on an anonymous blog. Nothing too big. Nothing too obvious. Just enough to make Victor look over his shoulder. Eleanor watched from her laptop. She could already picture him sitting in his ivory tower, feeling the first itch of doubt, the first spark of fear. She closed her laptop, eyes cold. This is war. Victor Langley thought he had won, thought he had buried her for good. But Eleanor Graves was still breathing. And now, she wasn't just fighting for her empire. She was fighting to watch his burn. Victor had declared war. He just didn't know it yet. Eleanor Graves had once ruled the city. Now, she was erased. The morning after her release, she walked into a law firm she had worked with for years. The receptionist barely met her gaze. Mr. Halston isn't available. She tried another firm, then another. Doors slammed shut. She called old investors. Voicemail. She reached out to former partners. No response. Even her closest allies, the people who had profited off her brilliance, had disappeared. Her phone stopped ringing. Her inbox stayed empty. She wasn't just blacklisted. She was radioactive. She turned on the news. Langley Financial stock soared. Victor Langley praised for restoring integrity to the company. Analysts dissected her downfall. Eleanor Graves, once a rising star, is now facing the worst financial scandal in years. A cautionary tale of unchecked ambition. Victor Langley proves why he's still the king of Wall Street. She shut off the TV, walked to her window. The skyline she had once owned stretched before her, and for the first time in her life, she felt small. She had trusted Victor. That was her first mistake. She had believed in loyalty. That was her second. And worst of all, she had thought she was untouchable. Now she had nothing. No money. No allies. No name. She walked to her desk, picked up a pen. For the first time in her life, she considered signing the surrender papers. Victor had left them in her penthouse. A final insult. All she had to do was sign. Admit guilt. Disappear. And it would all be over. Her hand hovered over the page. Then, a knock at the door. She opened the door. No one there. Just an envelope on the ground. She picked it up, heart pounding. No return address. No markings. Inside, a single piece of paper. 5 words. They think it's over. Prove them wrong. Her breath hitched. Someone knew. Someone was watching. She clenched the note in her fist. The fog in her mind cleared. She wasn't done. Not yet. Eleanor Graves didn't beg. She didn't run. And she sure as hell didn't lose. She tossed the surrender papers into fireplace. She had nothing left, and that made her dangerous. Eleanor opened her laptop, pulled up old contacts. Not lawyers, not investors. People who hated Victor Langley as much as she did. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then she started typing. The war had just begun. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She sat at the small wooden desk in her penthouse, her prison, lit only by the cold glow of her laptop screen. The city stretched beyond her window, a city that had turned its back on her, a city she was about to take back. She typed the first name, then another, the people Victor had burned, the people he thought were finished. She wasn't looking for power brokers or billionaires. She was looking for exiles. Michael Crane, disbarred lawyer, once Victor's most trusted legal enforcer, now a ghost in the system. Lena Cho, genius hacker, set up Victor's digital empire until he framed her for cyber fraud and left her to rot. Daniel Ross, investigative journalist, once the best, now blacklisted because he dared to expose Langley Financial's shell companies. She sent the messages. Short, direct, no explanations. Meet me, midnight, you know where. Then she closed the laptop. Victor had declared war. He just didn't know it yet. The bar was empty. The neon sign flickered. A place forgotten by time, where people whispered in corners and deals were made in the dark. Eleanor stepped inside. 3 figures sat in the back booth. She walked over. No greetings. No pleasantries. She dropped a folder on the table. Crane flipped it open first. His eyes widened. Bank records. Offshore accounts. Illegal trades. Lena whistled. Damn. Daniel just leaned back. How'd you get this? Eleanor's lips curled. Does it matter? Silence. Then Crane smirked. I'm in. Lena grinned. Same. Daniel took another look at the papers. Then he met Eleanor's gaze. Let's burn him to the ground. Victor Langley woke up to chaos. A small leak, just a whisper in the right places. A blog post. Anonymous. Well written. Backed with real numbers. Nothing directly tying Victor to fraud, but enough to make people ask questions. By noon, the whispers turned into headlines. Langley Financial facing allegations of offshore manipulation. By evening, regulators were calling. By the next morning, investors were nervous. Victor stormed into his office, barking orders. Find out who leaked it. Crush them. Bury it. He didn't know. He couldn't know that this was just the beginning. The trap closes. Eleanor watched from her new hideout. She wasn't running. She was hunting. Victor's empire wasn't going to fall in one blow. It was going to bleed. Slow. Painful. She leaned forward, staring at the stock charts. Langley Financial had its first real dip in years. Not much, but enough to make Victor sweat. She smirked. Let's see how you like losing everything. Victor Langley was a master control. For decades, he had built his empire on carefully placed deals, hidden accounts, and buried secrets. But control was a fragile thing, and Eleanor knew exactly where to hit. She sat in the dimly lit hideout, watching Lena Cho work her magic. The hacker's fingers flew across the keyboard. Firewalls bypassed. Confidential reports decrypted. Got it. Eleanor leaned forward. A single email thread. A conversation between Victor and a senator. Bribes. Insider trading. Illegal favors. Lena grinned. This is enough to start a fire. Eleanor shook her head. Not yet. This wasn't about exposing him too soon. This was about isolating him, making his allies doubt him. She turned to Daniel Ross. Leak it. Quietly. Daniel nodded. He knew what to do. The information wouldn't go public. Not yet. It would be whispered into the right ears. A senator, a regulator, a rival CEO, just enough to make them pull away. Victor wouldn't even see the knife coming. Victor Langley sat in his office, staring at his phone. Calls that should have been returned instantly now took hours. Meetings that were once guaranteed were now rescheduled. His allies, his lifeline, were hesitating. He knew what that meant. Someone was poisoning the well. He slammed his fist against the desk. Eleanor. She wasn't gone. She was moving, and that meant he needed to stop her. Victor Langley didn't believe in defense. He attacked. Within hours, Eleanor's hideout was compromised. Security cameras hacked. Private messages exposed. Even her team's bank accounts started freezing. Crane stormed in. Victor's retaliating. Lena cursed. He's trying to wipe us out before we get too far. Eleanor barely reacted. She expected this. She pulled out a burner phone, dialed a number, a single sentence, moved to phase 2. Victor thought he was hunting her. He didn't see the snare tightening around him. The stock dip had rattled him. The whispers had weakened him. Now, Eleanor was about to push him into a corner. Daniel Ross published a new exclusive report. Not a direct accusation, but a deep dive into Langley Financial's history. A look at suspicious trades, hidden losses, questionable partnerships. By the end of the day, Langley Financial's stock dropped another 4%. Small, but enough to make shareholders panic. Enough to make Victor scramble. Eleanor sat back, sipped her drink, and smiled. This was just the beginning. Eleanor Graves didn't need friends. She needed weapons. And in a war like this, People were weapons. She wasn't looking for clean-cut professionals. She was looking for the broken, the bitter, and the burned, the ones Victor Langley had stepped on, discarded, and destroyed. She opened her laptop. 3 names. 3 people with nothing left to lose. 3 people who would help her tear Victor apart. She sent the messages. No explanations. Just a time. A place. Then she waited. The diner smelled like stale coffee and regret. Michael Crane sat in the corner booth, drinking like a man who had nowhere to be. Once, he had been Victor Langley's personal lawyer. Now, disbarred, bankrupt, forgotten. Eleanor slid into the booth across from him. No greetings. No small talk. She pulled out a folder. Crane raised an eyebrow. If this is a job offer, I don't do law anymore. Eleanor smirked. Good, because this isn't law. This is revenge. She flipped the folder open. Bank records. Hidden offshore accounts. Transactions Victor thought were buried. Crane's entire career had been ruined covering up Victor's crimes. Now, Eleanor was handing him the first real bullet to fire back. Silence. Then Crane chuckled. I hope you have a plan, Graves. Eleanor leaned forward. I have more than a plan. I have a war. The warehouse smelled of dust and burnt circuits. A dozen disassembled computers lay scattered across workbenches. At the far end, a woman in a leather jacket sat hunched over screen. Lena Cho. She didn't look up as Eleanor approached. Took you long enough. Eleanor smirked. I wasn't sure you'd show. Lena's fingers flew across the keyboard. I've been waiting for this. She turned the laptop around. Eleanor's bank records appeared on the screen, or at least the forged ones. The documents Victor had planted to frame her. Lena looked up. You were set up. Eleanor nodded. I know. Can you prove it? Lena grinned. I can burn his entire network down. Eleanor crossed her arms. Not yet. We don't destroy him all at once. Lena tilted her head. Then what do we do? Eleanor's eyes turned cold. We make him suffer first. Daniel Ross had once been the best investigative journalist in the business. Then he wrote one article about Victor Langley. Now he was blacklisted, fired. No publisher would touch him. No newsroom would take his calls. He spent his days drinking whiskey in cheap apartments, watching the world move on without him, until Eleanor showed up at his door. She held up a USB drive. This is your ticket back. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Why should I trust you? Eleanor leaned against the doorframe. Because Victor Langley ruined both of us. She tossed the USB onto his table. Inside that drive, enough dirt to make him bleed. Daniel picked it up, turning it in his hands. He exhaled slowly. Then he nodded. Let's burn him to ground. The team was assembled. The first move had to be small. Subtle. Just enough to make Victor uneasy. Lena worked fast. Encrypted servers. Private emails. Hidden trade documents. She found a weakness. A quiet, little financial inconsistency. Not enough to sink Victor, but enough to raise questions. Eleanor turned to Daniel. Leak it. Quietly. The next morning, a small article appeared on an anonymous blog. Langley Financial's offshore accounts. A small glitch or something bigger? By noon, the whisper started. By evening, regulators were making calls. By midnight, Victor Langley knew. Eleanor sat back in her chair, watching the city lights. She could already picture Victor sitting in his skyscraper, feeling the first itch of panic, the first taste of fear. She smiled. This was only the beginning. Eleanor Graves wasn't in a rush to destroy Victor Langley. She wanted him to feel it first. She sat in the safe house, surrounded by Crane, Lena, and Daniel. The plan was simple. Small cuts, subtle hits, enough to weaken him before the killing blow. Lena pulled up the latest financial reports. Langley Financial has a problem. A shell company. One Victor used to hide losses and manipulate profits. It wasn't illegal yet, but if the wrong people saw it, it would be. Eleanor smirked. Let's put a spotlight on it. The next morning, an anonymous report surfaced. It didn't accuse Victor directly. It just asked questions. Unusual transfers at Langley Financial. Accounting oversight or something more? The market reacted. Langley Financial's stock dipped, not by much, but enough to rattle investors, enough to make regulators take a second look. Victor Langley sat in his office, jaw tight. Someone was coming after him. He just didn't know who. Not yet. Victor Langley wasn't the type to wait. Within hours, he struck back. Eleanor's remaining assets? Frozen. Her safe house? Compromised. Lena's accounts? Locked. Crane's apartment? Raided by private investigators. A warning. Back off, or be buried. Eleanor barely blinked. She expected this. She picked up her phone, dialed a number. A single sentence. Moved to phase 2. Jacob Price had been one of Eleanor's few remaining allies, a former Langley executive, ousted after Victor restructured the firm. Bitter, vengeful, perfect for Eleanor's team. Or so she thought. Crane was the first to notice. Jacob's been acting strange. Lena dug deeper. His phone pinged at Langley Tower last night. Eleanor's pulse slowed. That's not possible. But it was. Jacob had gone to Victor, and he had told him everything. Eleanor didn't panic. She simply moved faster. They cleared the safe house within minutes. By the time Victor's men arrived, Eleanor was already gone. She left behind a single note. Too slow. Victor Langley read it, and for the first time in years, he felt rage. The gloves were off. Eleanor wasn't just attacking his empire now. She was coming for him. The next hit would be bigger, louder. Victor had made a mistake. He let her escape. And now, she was going to tear him apart. The safe house wasn't supposed to be traceable. Lena had scrubbed all digital footprints. Crane had buried the lease in a web of fake names. It should have been secure. It wasn't. Eleanor woke to the sound of shattering glass. A flash grenade exploded in the main room. The windows blew inward. Smoke filled the air. She grabbed her laptop, ran for the back exit. Too late. Armed men stormed inside. Not police. Private security. Victor's people. She barely made it to the alley before a voice boomed through a loudspeaker. "Give up, Eleanor." She froze. The voice was coming from her own phone. Hacked. Compromised. She dropped it, smashed it under her heel. She had to keep moving. Behind her, the safe house erupted in flames. Everything inside, evidence, files, hard drives, destroyed. Years of work, gone in an instant. The next morning, Eleanor sat in a cheap motel room, staring at the TV. She knew what she was about to see, but she turned it on anyway. Victor Langley, standing at a press conference. Smug, composed, in control. "It's unfortunate what happened to Ms. Graves," he said, shaking his head. "But this proves what I've been saying all along. She was reckless. And now, she's nothing." Laughter from the reporters. A well-timed headline flashed across the screen. Eleanor Graves, the final collapse. Eleanor exhaled slowly. She had lost everything. Her empire, her evidence, her safe house. Victor had won. For now. Crane, Lena, and Daniel sat in silence. No one spoke. They had nothing left. Then, Lena frowned. "Wait." Eleanor looked up. "What?" Lena typed something. Fast. Pulled up an old contract. Something buried. Something Victor had overlooked. A single clause in a forgotten deal. A loophole. If used correctly, it could break Langley Financial from the inside. Eleanor's heartbeat picked up speed. She leaned in, read the contract. Then, for the first time in days, she smiled. Victor had missed something. A mistake. A tiny crack in his empire. And all she had to do was drive a knife straight through it. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Eleanor sat at the safe house table, eyes locked on her laptop screen. Lena was across from her, scrolling through files, scanning lines of code. Crane poured whiskey into a coffee cup. Daniel paced near the window. Something felt wrong. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling. Then, crash. The front window shattered inward. Glass flew across the room. A black canister hit the floor, spinning. Eleanor's stomach dropped. "Move." A flash grenade exploded. Blinding white light. A concussive boom. The walls shook. Smoke filled the air. Lena coughed, grabbing her laptop. Crane stumbled backward. Daniel reached for his phone. Too late. The door burst open. Dark figures poured in. Armed. Tactical gear. Not police. Victor's private security. Eleanor grabbed a hard drive. Spun toward the alley door. Bang. A bullet ripped through the wall inches from her head. She didn't stop. Didn't think. She ran. Smoke. Shouting. Footsteps pounding behind her. Everything was falling apart. She reached the alley door. Kicked it open. Daniel and Crane were right behind her. Lena trailed, coughing, gripping a laptop to her chest. They bolted down the alley. Behind them, the safe house erupted in flames. Eleanor stopped, turned, her stomach twisted. Everything inside, evidence, files, hard drives, gone. Years of work, wiped out in an instant. A voice crackled over a loudspeaker. "Give up, Eleanor." She froze. The voice came from her own phone. Hacked. Compromised. Victor was watching. Listening. She dropped it. Crushed it under her heel. Then she ran. The news broke before dawn. Eleanor Graves. Final collapse. She sat in a cheap motel, staring at the TV. Victor Langley stood at a podium. Smug. Confident. Untouchable. "It's a shame," he said, shaking his head. "But it proves what I've said all along. Eleanor Graves was reckless, desperate, dangerous." Reporters laughed. One asked, "Are you worried about any more attacks from her?" Victor chuckled. "Attacks? There's nothing left of her." Eleanor's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. She should be furious. But all she felt was cold. Victor thought it was over. And why wouldn't he? She had lost everything. No money. No resources. No proof. Nothing. But then, Lena froze. Her eyes locked on the laptop screen. Her fingers stopped typing. "Wait!" Eleanor looked up. "What?" Lena's fingers moved fast, pulling up files, scrolling through contracts. She muttered under her breath. "No way. No way." Eleanor, Crane, and Daniel crowded around the screen. A contract. Old. Buried. A deal Victor had signed years ago. Crane adjusted his glasses. "Why does this matter?" Lena pointed. "Because of that clause right there." Eleanor's heart pounded. She read it, then read it again. Then she smiled. Victor had missed something. A tiny crack in his empire. A mistake. And all she had to do was drive a knife straight through it. She looked at the team. Eyes sharp. Voice steady. "We're not done." Lena's fingers flew over the keyboard. Crane leaned in, squinting at the contract. Daniel read the same line over and over, then let out a low whistle. Eleanor just stared at the screen. It was right there, buried in legal jargon. Forgotten in years of acquisitions, mergers, and restructures. A single clause in an old contract. One Victor had overlooked, and it was the key to his downfall. Years ago, Victor Langley had absorbed a mid-sized wealth management firm. Standard practice. But the firm had a unique shareholder agreement. And buried in that agreement, a contingency clause. If certain financial discrepancies were discovered, all controlling shares would be placed into a legal freeze, pending an external review. Translation? If Eleanor could prove Langley Financial had been cooking the books, even slightly, Victor's entire empire would be locked down. No trades. No deals. Nothing. Eleanor exhaled slowly. This wasn't just a chance. This was a loaded gun. And she was about to pull the trigger. Eleanor sat back. Thought. Planned. They couldn't just drop this information. If they leaked it outright, Victor would bury it before it did real damage. They needed proof. And they needed to make him panic. She turned to Lena. "Can you dig deeper?" Lena cracked her knuckles. "Watch me." Crane smirked. "I assume I'll be handling the legal bomb when we drop it." Eleanor nodded. "And Daniel." The journalist grinned, already writing the story. They moved, fast, precise. This was Victor's final mistake. And now, Eleanor was going to make him pay. The next morning, the first hint of trouble surfaced. An anonymous tip landed on the desks of financial regulators. Not a direct accusation, just enough to make them curious, enough to make them start asking questions, enough to make Victor sweat. Victor Langley sat in his penthouse office, sipping his usual black coffee. His phone rang. He answered. "Sir, we have a problem." His CFO sounded uneasy. Victor frowned. "What kind of problem?" A pause. Then, "Regulators are looking into our books." Victor froze. His grip on the coffee cup tightened. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't random. This was Eleanor. She wasn't finished. And for the first time, Victor Langley felt fear. Eleanor knew something about men like Victor Langley. They didn't lose because of external attacks. They lost when their own people turned against them. And that's exactly what she planned to do, piece by piece, ally by ally. Victor had spent years building a fortress of influence. But trust? Loyalty? That was something he didn't believe in. And that meant his people were only with him as long as he was winning. So Eleanor was going to make them doubt, make them fear, make them run. And when Victor Langley looked around, he would find himself completely alone. Langley Financial CFO Mark Hayworth was a numbers man. He didn't care about power plays or personal wars. He cared about stability, about keeping the company profitable and clean. And right now, Langley Financial was looking shaky. A quiet email landed in his inbox. Anonymous, untraceable, a single sentence. "Look closer at the books. You're being set up as the fall guy." Attached, a small but damning piece of evidence. A financial transfer. Illicit, signed off by Victor himself. Mark Hayworth felt his stomach turn. If regulators dug deeper, they wouldn't blame Victor. They'd blame him. And Victor would let them. Mark reached for his phone. He needed to protect himself. And that meant considering other options. Exactly what Eleanor wanted. Monica Wells had been Victor Langley's top attorney for over a decade. Fierce, loyal, ice cold, but loyalty only went as far as self-preservation. And right now, Eleanor was going to make Monica feel trapped. Crane smirked as he held up the dossier. Monica won't flip unless she has no choice. Eleanor flipped through the pages. Illegal contracts, hidden offshore trusts, personal blackmail material. Lena grinned. "We make her believe Victor's about to go down. She won't go down with him." Eleanor nodded. "We push her, make her crack." A message landed in Monica's private inbox. Encrypted, untraceable. "We both know Victor would sell you out to save himself. When that moment comes, choose wisely." Attached, enough evidence to link her directly to Victor's crimes. She knew what it meant. Either she helped bury him, or she'd be buried with him. Monica sat in her penthouse, staring at the files, heart pounding. For the first time in years, she felt uncertain. And that was the beginning of her downfall. Victor Langley was bleeding. His stock was dipping. His CFO was hesitant. His top lawyer was suddenly distant. People who once feared him were now doubting him. And doubt was a cancer. It spread. He started lashing out, firing people, cutting off old allies, making rash decisions. His board members grew uneasy. Investors started looking for exits. And Eleanor? She watched, waiting for the moment when Victor Langley would make the biggest mistake of his life. Eleanor had spent weeks maneuvering Victor Langley into a corner. But this was checkmate. A live broadcast financial hearing. Not just an internal inquiry. Not just a private SEC review. Public, televised, unavoidable. The world would be watching. And Victor Langley was about to self-destruct in front of them. Eleanor knew exactly how Victor operated. He thrived in the shadows. Deals behind closed doors. Control without exposure. But take a man like that and drag him into the light, he'd burn. She made sure of it. Daniel Ross released one final leak. An article. Strategic, well-timed, vague enough to make Victor furious. Langley Financial CEO to face live hearing amidst fraud allegations. Victor saw the headline and lost it. Who authorized this hearing? He barked at his legal team. Monica Wells, his lawyer, barely met his gaze. Regulators had already confirmed attendance. The media was preparing questions. Backing out now would scream guilt. Victor had no choice. He had to play defense. Which meant, for the first time in his life, Victor Langley was about to play by someone else's rules. Eleanor's rules. The cameras rolled. Reporters packed the room. Screens in boardrooms and trading floors across the country were tuned in. Victor Langley sat at the table, flanked by his lawyers. He still looked like a king, composed, powerful, unshaken. For now, Eleanor watched from a private suite, listening, waiting. The committee chair leaned forward. Mr. Langley, we're here to discuss allegations of financial misconduct within your firm. Do you deny these claims? Victor gave his usual calm, dismissive smile. Absolutely. This is nothing more than a coordinated attack by individuals seeking revenge. Eleanor smirked. Right on cue. The trap was closing. Then the documents dropped. Lena had spent weeks hacking, pulling records, decoding transactions. And now they were on display for the world to see. A screen behind the panel lit up. Hidden offshore accounts. Fraudulent investments. Insider trading schemes. A paper trail leading straight to Victor. Gasps rippled through the room. Victor's smile froze. His fingers clenched the table. For the first time, his eyes flickered with panic. The committee chair spoke again. Mr. Langley, do you have an explanation for this? The cameras zoomed in. The world watched. Victor had seconds to react. And that's when he made his biggest mistake. He snapped. His voice rose. He called the allegations fabricated. He accused the committee of bias. He even lashed out at his own lawyers. But then he made the fatal slip. In his rage, he said too much. His own words connected him to fraud. The stock market reacted instantly. Langley Financial plummeted. Investors dumped shares. The empire Victor spent a lifetime building was collapsing in real time. And then, the final betrayal. A voice cut through the noise. I can confirm that those documents are real. Silence. Every camera in the room turned toward the speaker. Victor's right-hand man, Mark Hayworth, his CFO, the man who handled Victor's finances for years, the man who knew everything. And now, he was turning on him. Victor stared, frozen. Mark, don't. Mark ignored him. He looked straight at the panel. I have additional evidence. Eleanor leaned forward, heart pounding. This was it. The killing blow. The committee called for an immediate investigation. Victor's lawyers went pale. His stock free fell. Board members started resigning. Langley Financial was imploding on live TV. And Victor Langley? He sat there, jaw clenched, hands shaking, completely alone. Eleanor exhaled, watching from her suite. It was over. Victor had spent years ripping people apart, and now he was the one being torn down. She stood, walked to the window, looked at the city that once belonged to him, and she smiled, because by the end of the day, Victor Langley would have nothing left. The morning after the hearing, the world woke up to chaos. Every major news outlet ran the same headline. Victor Langley exposed fraud, corruption, and betrayal at the highest level. Eleanor sat in a high-rise suite, sipping black coffee, watching unfold. The broadcast played footage of Victor at the hearing. Red-faced, furious, cornered. Mark Hayworth's testimony had been the final blow. And now, Langley Financial was bleeding out. Eleanor leaned back. The real bloodbath was just beginning. Lena's voice crackled over the speakerphone. We ready for the final drop? Eleanor exhaled. Do it. A new set of documents hit the public servers. This time, it wasn't just financial fraud. It was everything. Bribes to politicians. Blackmail on business rivals. Secret recordings of Victor admitting to insider trading. And the worst? A leaked video. A conversation between Victor and his board members. His voice dripping with arrogance. If the SEC ever comes knocking, we throw Hayworth under the bus. No one touches me. The same CFO who had just betrayed him on live TV. Victor Langley had officially destroyed himself. The market reacted instantly. Langley Financial's stock crashed. Investors pulled out in droves. Regulators froze assets. Board members resigned in waves. Victor Langley's empire, decades in the making, was crumbling in real time. Inside Langley Tower, phones rang nonstop. Staff panicked. Lawyers fled. Victor sat in his corner office, gripping his desk, watching billions disappear. His private accounts? Locked. His emergency funds? Seized. For the first time in his life, Victor Langley had nothing. Eleanor waited for the moment, and then the breaking news alert hit the screen. Victor Langley arrested for financial crimes. The live feed switched to Langley Tower. Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted. And then he appeared. Victor Langley, handcuffed, his $5,000 suit wrinkled, his hair disheveled, his face pale, dragged out his own skyscraper, the same way he had once watched Eleanor being led away in disgrace. Only this time, no one was coming to save him. Eleanor smirked. Victor always thought the strongest survived, but he forgot one thing. The strong don't survive. The smartest do. And Eleanor Graves had just won. Eleanor wasn't done yet. Victor Langley was rotting in a jail cell, but his enablers still walked free. Monica Wells, his top lawyer, the one who kept his secrets, buried the bodies. Jacob Price, the traitor who sold her out when she needed him most. They thought they could disappear. They were wrong. Monica ran first. She cleaned out her office, vanished overnight. She thought she was safe. Then the subpoena landed. Multiple counts of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Eleanor had made sure every illegal deal, every falsified document had Monica's signature. No plea deal. No escape. Monica was finished. Jacob tried to cut a deal. He went to the feds, offered to cooperate. Then he realized Eleanor had already given him everything. Jacob wasn't useful. He was expendable. When the dust settled, he had nothing. No allies. No future. Just another traitor left behind. Eleanor didn't waste time thinking about him. She had bigger things ahead. The headlines changed. Eleanor Graves, the real victim of Langley's corruption. Exonerated. All charges dropped against former finance mogul. Victor Langley's lies unraveled. How he framed his own protege. The world finally saw the truth. Eleanor wasn't a fraud. She was the only one who had been honest all along. Her name was restored. And now she had a choice to make. The offer, reclaiming her throne. The phone call came at dawn. A group of investors. High profile. Powerful. They wanted her to come back. Rebuild. Lead. Take control. Victor's empire was dead. But Eleanor? She could take everything he left behind. She could rule again. But did she want to? She stared at the skyline. She had already won. Did she really need to own this world again? She had one more move to make, and it would change everything. Eleanor Graves stood in the boardroom of a new empire. Not Victor's. Hers. The investors sat across from her, waiting for her to take the throne. Langley Financial is gone, one of them said. We want you to build something bigger. The deal was massive. Control, power, unlimited resources. Everything she had fought for, everything she had lost. Now, it was hers for the taking. Eleanor folded her hands, paused, thought. Then she smiled, and she said no. The investors stared, shocked, confused. No one said no to power. But Eleanor had seen the truth. This world, corporate takeovers, stock manipulation, endless greed. It was all the same. She had won the game. But the game itself? It was rigged, corrupt, poisonous. She wasn't going to play by their rules anymore. She was going to burn the whole system down. Over the next few months, Eleanor moved in silence. She used her connections, her resources, her mind. She didn't build another empire. She dismantled the old ones. One by one, the fraud networks that had protected men like Victor collapsed. Shady hedge funds, offshore tax havens, dark money pumping through politics. Exposed, destroyed. For the first time, the real villains were the ones falling. She had become something more powerful than a CEO. She had become the reckoning. One last loose end. A small box sat on her desk. She opened it. Inside, Victor Langley's gold pen. The one he had used to sign away her empire. The one he had offered her when he told her to surrender. Eleanor picked it up, rolled it between her fingers. Then she tossed it into the trash. No hesitation. No second thoughts. She had no use for Victor's legacy. She had outgrown it. Eleanor Graves stepped out of the building, breathing in the cold night air. No bodyguards. No cameras. No weight on her shoulders. She had power. But more importantly, she had freedom. She walked down the street, hands in her pockets, disappearing into the city. No longer chasing revenge. No longer playing the game. For the first time in her life, she was truly free.